Now, another great little term you come up with, because a lot of these, when you bring up concepts that I've been familiar with in other contexts, you have really good names for them. So you have another one called the day two problem, which I'd like if you could explain exactly what that is.
Yeah, the day two problem is just that if we're able to effectuate a distribution of our resources and allocation of holdings in the way that we want to. So putting aside for a second whatever challenges or difficulties there were that led up to that. But if we're finally able to get a distribution of resources that looks like the one we want.
We'll give you a magic button. You can just push it and make it.
We'll wave the magic wand, and everything today is exactly the way we think it should be, whatever way that is. If it's exactly equal or whatever distribution it is, we have it today. The problem is that immediately, by day two, as I put it, things start changing. And the reason for that goes back to what you mentioned a minute ago, which is the herding cats problem. Human beings begin behaving in ways that you can't predict. They start trading, exchanging, innovating. Their preferences change. Their preferences change dynamically based on what other people's changes are and other people's preferences. So immediately, you have a new distribution signature of resources and wealth and whatever it was that we were distributing the first time around, which means we're faced with another problem. So on day two, as it were, we have to decide, well, are we going to let things just continue on in the way that they would, with letting people continue to make decentralized, localized decisions about how to spend their time, talent, and treasure? Or do we need to have another redistribution? And what you typically see is that people say, no, we have to do it all over again. And this is now faced with two more difficulties. One, you're going to have to start restricting people's behaviors in lots of ways, including in many cases in ways that we would think would conflict with people's individual rights, their rights to their property, their rights to liberty, etc. But there's also a resources cost, and that is that you're now getting a large and increasing number of people whose job it is to get information about what the new distribution looks like. They're gathering, there's a mechanism for taking resources from one place and then another mechanism to distribute it to another. You're monitoring people's behavior. And this itself causes an enormous amount of cost. It's usually seen as opportunity cost. So these people could have been engaging in other productive activity. They're not doing that now. And you also have the problem that we shouldn't discount, which is that at the margins, people's incentive to continue producing things and changing, exchanging, cooperating as they would like, their incentive to do so decreases ever so slightly. So at each iteration, so the day two problem means you're faced with again having to make yet another distribution, and there's a good chance that either you'll have less to redistribute the second time, or at least that the rate of growth won't be as high as it otherwise would have been. So,
and you mean less to distribute because of the combination of A, the administrative overhead and leakage, and B, the diminished productive capacity because the incentives have changed.
Right,
mostly.
Exactly. And then so each iteration you have, so the day two problem, I mean, that phrase is a metaphor. It doesn't have to be a day. It could be a week or a month or a year. But even if you extend out the time, the longer time you have between these iterations, the more difficult it becomes because the actual signature of resources and innovation and cooperation in society changes dynamically and continuously. So it's going to get further and further away from whatever your plan was on day one. So the longer you wait, the more difficulties you'll have. And if you're going to try to reset things again a second time to where you would like them to be, the costs involved are just that much greater. So the day two problem is that you can't, is that even if you assume that everything was exactly the way it should be, say morally ought to be on day one, you're faced with exactly the same problem again on day two and then on day three, et cetera. And that problem will never go away.
If the problem is that our tastes and interests as human beings and the way we behave, our propensity to truck and barter leads to upsetting patterned distributions, then, I mean, you've given us reasons why trying to fix the day two problem on day 3, 4, and 5 isn't going to work very well or is going to have consequences we don't like. But couldn't the alternative be to address the day 2 problem on, say, day -1 or day -2? I'm thinking of, like the notion of what we need is a socialist man, or in Plato's Republic, his elaborate system for educating the rulers and making sure that they have precisely the right kinds of interests and the right behaviors to sustain the state, that maybe we don't need to deal with those problems if we can, have an educational system that makes it so that people aren't constantly wanting the new thing, don't want to upgrade their iPhone every year but are content with the one that they've got, and then we won't have to worry about upsiding patterns.
Yeah, good luck with that. And imagine what you would have to do. So you mentioned Plato's Republic. So you're right. So Plato has a very elaborate system of education that he envisions for the people who will eventually become the philosopher kings. But there's a very substantial trade-off that's involved, not just with liberty, but also with prosperity. So all of the people in Plato's Republic, with not even accepting the philosopher kings themselves, who also have to be forced to assume their role on his view, every one of them is assigned a place in society, notwithstanding whatever it is they themselves would like to do. So the philosopher king determines what the ideal role for every single person and every single class of people in society is in the service of the overall good society that the philosopher king is imagining. So you have a very substantial limitation of liberty. So if effectively no one has the liberty to order their own lives the way they would like. And I think that's very deeply inconsistent with any kind of liberal conception of government, certainly the classical liberal conception of government that I endorse. But there's also the very substantial cost with productivity. You're not going to be getting cooperative innovation, and that's a cost that you have to take. You have to think long and hard about whether that's a trade-off you're worth making. I mean, is it really the case that people don't want the next iPhone? That they don't, and not just iPhones, but do they really not want the next kind of pharmaceutical drug or medical procedure? Do they not want to have whatever the innovations would be that would allow people to do research into Alzheimer's or breast cancer, et cetera? I mean, what you're doing if on the day -1, as you said, or the day -2, what you're doing is effectively locking the society in at that stage and not allowing it to evolve or change or progress past that. And, a way to think about, and so that's certainly not a society that I would want to live in, and I think most people wouldn't. And, the way to think about it is, suppose people had decided to do this in, let's say, 1950. Well, would you still want to live in the world, give up all the things that we've been able to creatively and destructively generate in a market economy since 1950? That would include things like the internet. How many people would be willing to give up things like the internet? But
I wouldn't know it was going to exist, so I wouldn't be missing anything. So we could just lock us all into 1950. I mean, didn't England in their socialist planning
Cuba,
in the 50s?
Right?
Yeah, exactly, Cuba. And we all drive
cool
cars. And, yeah.
Cool cars. Yeah, go try living in Cuba. So
I want an Edsel. It's okay. I mean, just a thing.
I'm being flippant about it, but I think it's easy for us now. So we live now, we in America today, you and I talking on this, or anybody who's listening to this podcast, we have to remember that we have at our fingertips resources that previous generations couldn't have imagined. So by any historical standard, we are fabulously wealthy. So even those of us who think, well, I'm not in the 99th, I'm not in the 1%, I'm in the the 2% or the 5%. Historically speaking, we are all in the 99.99th percentile of human history. So it's easy for us to say, well, sure, wouldn't it be fine to give up a little bit here at the margins or there at the margins? But the people who really who feel the bite of that, and because we're as wealthy as we are, we perhaps can absorb some of those costs. The people who really feel the bite of that are the people who are lower down on the economic spectrum. They're the ones who really suffer from not having the opportunity to raise themselves up or to create more prosperity in their lives. They're the ones who really suffer from it. And I think one of the chief central and indeed moral goals of political economy is not so that we can flatter the moral sensibilities of those of us who are lucky enough to be at the very highest in human history of human wealth and prosperity. But rather, we got to focus on what are the effects that that's going to have on the rest of the people, and including the bottom billion who are alive today. What effects are those kinds of policies going to have on them? And if we want to have any kind of chance of enabling them to ascend out of poverty, ascend out of all the miseries of poverty, the centralizing the effects, the negative unintended consequences of attempting to centralize economies are going to redound especially hard on them.